In this lesson, we will solve rational equations. So up to this point, we have been simplifying, multiplying, etc., but we've never actually had an equal sign. And so that's what we're going to be dealing with now, is an equation that actually involves rationals. So we're going to utilize one of two methods that will eliminate the denominator, because that's what we're trying to do. Of course, we first have to restrict the domain. So this is where it's really going to come into play to restrict that domain. But one, if we have two fractional terms that are equal to each other, so two fractions, we're just going to cross multiply like we did any other time we would have a proportion. If we have three terms or more, etc., then we're going to multiply by that LCD, which we just talked about in the complex fractions video. So let's try a few. So here's one already worked out for us, just so that you have one to look back on as a reference. First thing we would do is look at the denominator and determine the restrictions on the domain. So here I know that if I set this equal to 0, x would be 0. If I set this equal to 0, it wouldn't matter because there's no x. If I set this equal to 0, x would be 0. So my only restriction is that x cannot be 0. Now I'm going to look at 3x and 6 and x and say, what would be my LCD? The LCD would be 6x, because I would take the 3 from here, the 2 from here, really, because it's 3 times 2, and the x, the most number of times it happens is once. So 6x is my LCD. If I take the first value times 6x, the x's cancel, 6 over 3 reduces, and I get 2. Here the 6's cancel, and I get 5 times x, which is 5x. And here the x's cancel, so I get 6 times 2, which is 12. So this is one of those where I'm going to obviously use the LCD, because now notice I have a nice, easy to solve equation. Up here, this was crazy. There was no way for me to really add and subtract things unless I changed everything to a common denominator, and then I would still have a fraction. If we multiply by the LCD, notice it gets rid of the fraction. So now this is a simple two-step equation. I'm going to subtract 2 from each side. I'm going to divide by 5 on each side. I'm going to find that x is 2. Now when I get to an answer like this, that's when I go back and look at the restrictions on my domain. If I would have done all of that work and it said that x was 0, and I already said x couldn't be 0, I would say there's no solution. Here, 2 is not 0, and so 2 is a solution. And of course you can do a check. You can plug the 2 in and make sure everything works out, and in this case it does. But really I would double check that with my domain each time. For this example, notice that I only have two terms and they're both fractions, so instead of doing the whole LCD thing, this is one where I would do the cross multiplication. So I would take 3 times 3y minus 2 and set it equal to 3 times y plus 5. Restricting my domain, I would say that y can't be -5 and it can't be positive 2/3. So there's my restriction. When I solve, I could distribute the 3, which is probably what I'll do. What I see right away is that the 2 3's could cancel, but many of us would not see that right away, and so let's go ahead and do this the longer way. And I would end up with 9y minus 6 and 3y plus 15. I would subtract the 3y from each side. I would add the 6 to each side. And then I would divide by 6. And 21 over 6 reduces. 3 would go into the top, and 3 would go into the bottom. And I would end up with 7/2. And then of course I would come back over here and check it to make sure that 7/2 wasn't one of my restrictions, and it's not. And so that is my final answer. Here, I have a common denominator of a minus 6 on 2 of my terms, but not the last. But that means that's very easy. It tells me everything needs to be multiplied by a minus 6, including the 5. So for my first term, the a minus 6's cancel, and I get 2. And of course my domain is that a can't be 6. For the second, I get minus 5 times a minus 6, which we'll have to distribute. And for the third, I get 2 times a minus 5, which I'll have to distribute because the a minus 6 is canceled. So distributing the minus 5, I get minus 5a and plus 30. Be careful on that one. I've got a minus and a minus. That's not equals, that's minus. Here I have 2a minus 10 by distributing. Now, of course, I'm going to combine like terms. So this 2 and this 30 can reduce to 32. They can simplify, combine together, etc. Let's go ahead and add 5a to each side. And that leaves me with 32 equals 7a minus 10. I would add 10 to each side and get 42 equals 7a, and divide by 7 to get a equals 6. But hold on, we already said that a can't be 6, but I said that a is 6. So what does that mean? That means no solution. There's no number that I can plug in here that will make this work at all, except for 6, but we already said 6 doesn't work. Here are 2 for you to try on your own. So press pause, try them both, then press play to see how you did. For the first, this is obviously 2 fractions, so the easiest way to go about this is to do your cross multiplication. I would distribute that 4, of course, so 4x minus 8 equals 9x. I would subtract 4x from each side. That gives me negative 8 equals 5x, and then divide by 5 to get negative 8/5. Again, always check it against your domain so we know that x can't be 0. Oops, can't be 0, and x can't be 2 because 2 minus 2 would be 0. And so that one's okay. For my second, my restriction would be that x cannot be 0. My denominator that would be in common would be 12 and x, so 3 and 4 and x. So I'm going to take everything times 12x. It might be easier to just write it on each one. And remember, it's really 12x over 1, 12x over 1. The first one, the 12x and the 3x, the x's would reduce, and the 3 and the 12 would reduce to 4, and that gives me 24. For the second, 12 and 4 reduce to 3 and 1. So 3 times x times 5 is 15x. And for my last term, just the x's would reduce and I would get 36. I would then subtract the 24 from each side so that I can get that x by itself. And that gives me 15x equals 12. I would then divide by 15 on each side. And 12/15, not a whole number, but I could reduce it by 3. So divide that by 3 and divide that by 3, and I get 4/5.